We started our series on Exodus last weekend, and if you missed it, I'm glad that you're here today. We are still building the basis for our series, so you are not behind. You will catch up. It's not a problem at all. I do want to encourage you, if you're going to be here, we have a whole bunch of pamphlets for the book of Exodus that you can go through. There's study questions. There's things that you might find of interest about the book of Exodus, and that's located on this on the table at the back set of pews. And so I encourage you to grab one of those. This morning, I have 2 points. 2 points. God is working a good plan in your life. God is working a good plan. And the second point is that the plans built on His promises rarely work out the way we think they're going to. Those are our 2 points. So I encourage you to still listen to the rest of the sermon. But just so you know, that's where we're at. We are talking about the beginning of Exodus, and Exodus we're going to learn some things about the people and how they felt forgotten. And I wonder here this morning, as we get started, have you ever felt like nobody cares? Like you are forgotten about, like your worries and troubles don't matter to anybody else? It's where we find ourselves as we start the book of Exodus. We have, at the beginning of Exodus, the people of Israel are moving to Egypt. They have gone to Egypt, and we see that they show up, and there are 70 in the family of Israel. Jacob and his sons and his grandchildren, and there are 70 who go to Egypt. 70. And then we read in verse 7 that Billy just read, that they have increased in number and become so numerous that the land was filled with them. 70 to a very large number. The kind of words that they use here determines that the growth that they were seeing was exceedingly strong. They're growing fast and they're growing big as a people. That they're like rabbits, okay? They have bred, and there are a lot of them at this point. There are so many people. And we start to read through this part of the Bible, and you read through and you'll notice that there's a lot of names. And if you've been reading through, you notice that there's a lot of unfortunate names. You start coming up and it's like Gad. Who named their kid Gad? Who names their kid something like this? I mean, you feel good for Joseph, and you feel good for Benjamin, but Gad? I mean, it gets a little ridiculous. But these people have come to Egypt. And they have moved to Egypt, and they have become great in number. And while this has all happened, they still feel forgotten. It seems like God has forgotten us. Sometimes I think we feel the same way. God, I felt abandoned. I felt more like there is a God, and I'm sure He's good, but He sure doesn't care about me. We feel that way from time to time. There's a God. I believe that there's a God, but He doesn't seem to care about my life. There's a God, and I know He's good, but man, I'm going through some struggles. Where is He in this? For 400 years, the people of God in Egypt have not heard from Him. They sit in slavery, and many wonder, does He care anymore? We still believe that He exists, but are His promises still true? Is He going to make us into a great nation? And they begin to wonder. But even in the silence of Egypt, even in their darkest hour, God is busy keeping His promises. The story of God and His people starts with Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. Verses 1 through 3 say this. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country with your kindred and with your father's house and to the land that I will show you. And I will make you a great nation. And I will bless you, and I will make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and whoever dishonors you, I will curse. And in all the families of the earth shall be blessed because of you." Abraham was given a promise. You will become a great nation. This is the promise that we're going to talk about this morning. That God keeps His promises. God has kept His promise to Abraham. And it's an interesting promise that God made to him. God goes to Abraham, this really old man. I mean, he's in his 90s. And says to him, you are going to be the father of a great nation. Abraham has no children. He's almost 100 years old. His wife is 90. You're going to be the father of many nations. You're going to be a great nation. Your children are going to be countless. And you wonder, God, how can that be? God, how can you mean that? Now, if you're going to be the father of a great nation, you kind of need some sons. It's kind of a part of having a great nation. You have to have people that come along after you. You get the promise coming in a way that doesn't make any sense, which is pretty typical of God. That God makes a promise, but He's going to test your faith in it. He makes a promise, but He says, I want you to believe. I want you to have to push yourself to believe this. I know it doesn't make sense because your wife is 90, that you're going to be the father of a great nation. But God says, I'm going to. Reading on, look toward heaven and number the stars. Count them, He says. Count the stars, and if you're able to number them, so shall your offspring be. That will be the number of your children. Look up there. That's how many children you will have. And the scripture said, and he believed the Lord, and it was counted to him as righteousness. He believed God. At 100 years old, he believed God, that God was going to do something big. His promise to Abraham, you will have a son, and out of that son a great nation will be born. Abraham has this discussion with God out looking at the stars, and he has to walk back into the tent and tell his 90-year-old wife, hey, you're going to be a mom. She laughs. It's almost one of those, you really think I'm going to be a mom? I'm 90 years old, Abraham. I'm not going to be anybody's mom. That's not the way it works. I know you're a man, and so you don't get this, but I'm not going to be a mom. But God had promised it, and Abraham believed it. And here's an important note. Abraham never sees this promise come true. Abraham has a son. He sees that. But he doesn't see a great nation. In his life, he never sees the thousands upon thousands. Abraham goes to his grave, clutching in his hand nothing but a promissory note from God and one son. That's what Abraham dies with. A promise from God and one son. Abraham dies and he's clutching these promises that have yet to be fulfilled. See, the plans of God rarely play out like we think they will. Yet if we're reading this as a story, then we have to look at what is happening here. 70 come into Egypt. And then by chapter 7, verse 1, I just want to skip ahead and read this part for you. But the people of Israel were fruitful and increased greatly. They multiplied and grew exceedingly strong, so that the land was filled with them. And in verse 12, verse 37, we finally get a number. And the people of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. We're not counting the women and children. 600,000 men that were of fighting age. This doesn't count the boys, this doesn't count the old men, and it doesn't count any of the women. And we are told that they have become a great nation, that they are a mighty nation. And if each one is married, you start to count it up, and we're at 1.2 million. Conservative estimates by historians and theologians are that when Israel walks out of Egypt, that when they finally leave, there's between 2.5 and 3.5 million people who walk out of Egypt. You read these verses and you start to realize God keeps His promises. His promise was to Abraham. His promise was to Abraham, you will become a mighty nation. You will become a great nation, numerous as the stars, and it's coming true. Yet when His promises come true, rarely do they work out the way we think they will. Isn't that sometimes how it happens? We hear something and it sounds good, but it doesn't go the way we expect it to go. That seems to be the story that happens in our lives. Is we say, God, I know you're going to keep your promise, but this way looks like the wrong way. God, I know that you're good and I know that you want to do these things, but this way doesn't look right, and it's hard to trust that it's going to work out. But that's what God says. That's what He does with His people over and over again. would have never guessed that his people would have gone into slavery. No one would have guessed that it would play out with oppression and hard labor and being marginalized and being abused. Nobody would have guessed that it would play out in the way that it did. Yet God's promises are moving forward. Sometimes this is how it looks in our lives too. God's promises are coming true, but we don't like how He chose to do it. We don't like how He chose to accomplish it. It is tough when we see it, and life is difficult and confusing, and loving the Lord in the midst of it all can get so confusing because we have so many worries. We sit and worry about the struggles of life, losing a job, cancer, divorce, some of life's biggest speed bumps, and there's pain. And we say, God, I thought you loved me. God, I thought you had plans for me. God, I thought you had a future for me. God is never in pain because He knows in the end it's all right. And so He's not worried about your illness. He's not freaking out about your anxiety or fear. There's just no fear in Him because He knows the end and He is working His plan. And just because it involves some speed bumps and some struggles doesn't mean that He's not good. Trust Him. Trust Him. This morning you might say, I don't know if I can trust God. I don't know if I can trust Him with the things that I've been through. Let's acknowledge what He's done. If it's time to trust Him, then we have to acknowledge what He has done. We have a God who's not afraid to go through the pain to bring out the end that we need. But we say we don't want to go through the pain. We don't want to go through the struggles, right? We have a God that went through the cross to bring us to where we need to be. We have a God who said, I don't want to die, but for them I will. And He went to the cross, and His body was broken, and His blood was spilled for us. He went through the hard things for us so that good could come. So that good could come. I don't know where you're at this morning, but I promise you our God has been through more than you can imagine. And even if you have to go through some hard things, He has good for you and He has a plan for you. He wants to save you. You have not been forgotten. You may have walked in a moment today that you're in a real high point. Maybe you just got a promotion or you just found the girl you're going to marry. You have all this money right now, so you come in on a high. Or maybe it's the worst day of your life. And maybe you walked in and the floor has fallen out from underneath you. And you're in this season that's so low. And I promise you, it's just a season. But you're in a season where you are struggling like you've never struggled before. And you wonder, how could God have turned His head away from me? How could He have turned His back on me? I promise you that's not what's going on here. The book of Exodus stands as a strong reminder that God keeps His promises. That even in the times where He seems absent or we're going through struggles, He cares for us and He longs to see good for us. He's working a plan, and God is good. God has a plan for you. And it is our job, like Abraham's, to believe it, even when we can't see it. It's our job, like it was Abraham's, to believe it even when we can't see it. Abraham believed it even when he just had one son, that God's promises would come true. God asks that we would believe Him this morning. He is faithful. He keeps His promises. Even if it's not how you expected, God keeps His promises. This morning, will you trust Him? Will you trust Him? Trust Him to be true and trust Him to save, even if what you're expecting in life doesn't seem to make sense. That is our challenge today as we begin the book of Exodus, is trust that God is going to have things get better. That God is going to be there for us in our lowest times to bring us through. We need to trust that God has this under control. And that is our challenge this morning. As the praise team comes up, I don't know where you're at in life, but we all go through some times that we don't understand. I hope and pray that we can turn to God with the faith of Abraham and say, I don't understand this, but God, I'm going to lean on you. I'm going to turn to you because you are the only one.